A steel beam the size of a tree trunk pinned a woman alive inside a burning car. Fuel spread across wet asphalt like a river looking for a spark. 300 people stood frozen in the rain, recording on their phones, doing nothing. Then one man, a construction worker in muddy boots, stepped through the crowd, looked at the fire, and moved toward it instead of away. He lifted what four men couldn't budge. He pulled her out with seconds to spare. Then he vanished before anyone learned his name. This is the story of Mason Ryder, the hero nobody recognized, and the woman who never stopped looking for him. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know we don't waste your time with stories that don't matter. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what's coming in the next parts of this story. Because trust me, it only gets more intense from here. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The storm hit Seattle the way bad news always does, without warning and all at once. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old iron, and the rain was coming down so hard it bounced off the pavement in a white mist that blurred the edges of everything. Traffic on Mercer Street had slowed to a crawl. Construction crews on the elevated bridge project above had already started calling it. Nobody worked in conditions like this, not safely. And workers were packing tools, pulling tarps over equipment, moving toward their trucks with heads down and collars up. Mason Ryder was one of the last ones still up there. He wasn't being heroic about it. He just hated leaving a job half-finished, and there was a section of rebar framing he'd been working on since morning that he wanted secured before the weekend. His foreman, a barrel-chested Samoan named Thule, had already yelled at him twice. "Ryder, weather's turning, we're done. 2 more minutes." "You said that 20 minutes ago." Mason glanced up from what he was doing. Rain dripped off the brim of his hard hat. He was 37 years old, lean in the way that comes from actual work rather than a gym membership, with hands that were calloused and scarred in patterns that didn't quite match the kind of labor you'd expect from a construction site. His face was the kind that had been through weather. Not just rain, but the other kind. The kind that leaves marks behind the eyes. "Go on," he said. "I'll lock up." Thule looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has learned not to argue with certain people. "Emma gets picked up at 6. "I know what time Emma gets picked up. Just making sure you know." Mason said nothing. He turned back to the rebar. Thule left, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the hammering of rain against metal and the distant hum of the city below. Mason worked steadily, not fast, not slow. The rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that panic accomplishes nothing. When you've cleared a building under fire, when you've administered field dressings in the dark, with your hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, a rainstorm on a Seattle bridge is just weather. He heard the sound before he saw what caused it. A deep metallic groan, followed by a crack like a rifle shot, and then the shriek of a steel cable snapping under tension it was never designed to hold. Mason was already moving before he fully understood why. The temporary support structure for the crane platform, an aging rig that should have been replaced 2 seasons ago, that everyone on the crew had quietly complained about and that management had quietly ignored, had been slowly losing its battle with the storm. Water had pooled in places it shouldn't. A weld had been stressed past its limit, and when the cable snapped, it sent a 400-pound horizontal beam swinging outward and downward with the kind of force that doesn't negotiate. It fell 40 feet. It landed on a car, Saab. The car was a midnight blue Mercedes-Benz S-Class, and it had been sitting in traffic on the street below the bridge like everything else, bumper to bumper, going nowhere. The driver was Evelyn Hart, 30 years old, CEO of Hart Dynamics, and she had been trying to end a phone call with her CFO, while simultaneously telling her assistant to move her 7 o'clock dinner to 8, and she had not seen the shadow falling toward her. The beam hit the roof of the Mercedes with a sound like a thunderclap and compressed the driver's side down to about 18 inches of clearance. The windshield exploded inward. The door crumpled like cardboard. Evelyn was still alive, barely, pinned by the collapsed roof against her seat. Her left arm twisted at an angle that wasn't quite right, a cut above her eyebrow streaming blood into her eyes. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. And she could smell the gasoline. The fuel line had ruptured on impact. Gas was pooling under the car, mixing with rainwater, spreading across the asphalt in a shimmering dark slick that was moving with the current of the storm drain toward the stopped cars nearby. If there was a spark from any of the stopped engines, from a phone battery, from anything, the math was very simple and very bad. Evelyn tried to speak. What came out wasn't words. Outside the car, the street had erupted into something between panic and paralysis. Drivers abandoned their vehicles and ran. People on the sidewalk backed away. Someone was screaming. Someone else was on the phone, presumably with 911, though what the dispatcher could do about a burning Mercedes with a 400-pound steel beam sitting on top of it was unclear. Several men had approached the car, taken one look at the beam, and retreated. One person was filming. A woman in a yellow raincoat was standing 10 feet away, both hands pressed to her mouth, unable to look away and unable to do anything else. Mason came off the bridge access stairs at a run. He'd seen it happen. He'd seen the beam fall. He'd been moving before it landed because, in certain situations, the body doesn't wait for the brain to catch up. It acts on pattern recognition built from years of training that you never quite get out of your system, no matter how long you've been out. He crossed the street without stopping. A man grabbed his arm. Hey, you can't go near that, it's going to blow." Mason looked at him, not unkindly, just directly, the way someone looks at you when they've already made a decision and your opinion isn't going to change it. "Let go of my arm," he said. The man let go. Mason crouched beside the car and got his first real look at the situation. The beam had landed across the roof and the A-pillar, bending everything inward. He could see Evelyn through the shattered window, eyes open, conscious, one arm pinned, blood on her face, breathing in shallow gasps. He could smell the gas and hear the faint ticking of hot metal in the rain. He put his face at the window. "Hey." His voice was even, almost conversational. "Can you hear me?" Evelyn turned her head toward him. Her eyes were having trouble focusing. I can't get out." I know, I'm going to get you out. What's your name?" "Evelyn." A pause. "Evelyn Hart." "Okay, Evelyn, I'm Mason. I need you to stay very still for me. Don't try to move your arm. Don't try to move at all. Can you do that?" She stared at him. There was something about his voice, not comforting exactly, but certain, like someone who has been in worse situations and came out the other side. "Yes," she said. "Good." Mason stood up and turned around. There were maybe 40 people watching from a distance of 20 to 30 feet. He assessed them the way he had once assessed every new situation, quickly, without judgment, looking for what was actually there rather than what he wished was there. Most of them were scared. Some were useless with fear, but a few. He could see it in the way they were standing, the way their hands weren't quite at their sides, were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. That was something he could work with. He pointed at a man in a construction vest standing near the sidewalk. "You, come here." The man blinked, then walked over. Mason pointed at another one, a younger guy, broad shoulders, looked like he'd done physical work. "You too." "Is it going to explode?" the first man asked. "Might," Mason said. "That's why we're going to move fast. I need you on this side of the beam, both hands here." He indicated a section of the beam away from the worst of the fuel slick. "When I say lift, you lift with everything you've got. You don't stop. You don't think about stopping. You just lift." "That thing weighs—" "I know what it weighs. Are you lifting or not?" The man looked at him for a second. Something in Mason's face settled the question. "Yeah, I'm lifting." Mason turned to the crowd. "Everyone else, back up another 20 feet. If you see fire, you run. Don't run toward us, run away. If you're on the phone with 911, tell them we have an active fuel leak and we need fire suppression on scene immediately." He didn't wait to see if they complied. He turned back to the car. The truth was, he'd done the physics in his head already. The beam was 400 pounds, give or take, and it was resting at an angle that meant most of the weight was distributed across the roof structure rather than sitting vertically on it, which meant that with the right leverage and 3 people lifting at the optimal point, they could get it shifted. Not lifted entirely, but tilted enough to create clearance on the driver's side. Maybe 8 to 10 inches. Maybe enough. It would be close. He positioned the 2 men at a section of beam near the front of the car and crouched to grip an end section himself. The beam was cold and wet, and his gloves were soaked through. "On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. They lifted. The man in the construction vest would tell his wife that he genuinely didn't believe they'd moved the beam at all, that it felt like trying to lift a truck, that nothing happened for the first 2 seconds, that he was about to give up. And then something shifted. He looked down the beam to where Mason was and saw the man's entire body locked in a kind of terrifying stillness. Face gone blank, jaw set, every muscle in his arms and shoulders rigid, holding a weight that looked impossible from the outside. And somehow the beam was moving. 6 inches, 7, 8. Now, Mason said through his teeth to the woman in the yellow raincoat who had moved without being asked to the driver's window. Pull her toward you, straight out, slow. The woman, her name was Patricia, she would later tell reporters. She was a retired nurse and she didn't entirely know why she'd stepped forward, reached through the window and took hold of Evelyn's uninjured arm. This is going to hurt, Patricia said. I know, Evelyn said, and then, do it anyway. Patricia pulled. Evelyn moved, a few inches, then a few more, sliding across the seat, face contorted, making a sound that wasn't quite a scream because she was holding most of it inside. Her pinned arm came free. Her legs followed. Patricia caught her weight, and they both went down to the wet pavement together. Mason let the beam drop. The sound it made coming back down shook the pavement. He didn't wait. He crossed to where Patricia was holding Evelyn up, crouched, got an arm under Evelyn's knees and another behind her back, and stood up. She was lighter than the beam, which was not saying much given the state of his arms. He walked with her, not ran, walked, because running on wet pavement while carrying an injured person in shock was how you ended up with 2 patients instead of 1, to a point on the sidewalk about 60 feet from the car. He set her down against the wall of a parking structure, gently, with the care of someone who has handled people in shock before and knows that gentleness is sometimes the only thing you can actually give. You're clear, he said. You're safe. Evelyn grabbed his wrist. Her grip was stronger than he expected, given everything. She looked up at him, rain in her eyes, blood drying at her temple, her face a complicated map of pain and something else, something harder to name. You didn't have to do that, she said. Sure I did. You could have been killed. He looked at her for a moment. The car didn't blow. It could have. He shrugged, not dismissively, but in the way of someone for whom the calculation had been obvious enough not to require much deliberation. Someone had to go in. Somewhere behind them, the Mercedes erupted. Not dramatically. Not the way cars explode in movies, in a fireball that rolls across the sky. It was quieter than that. A sudden whomp of pressurized fuel catching, a wall of orange heat that pushed the air outward and drove the watching crowd another 10 feet back. The beam was visible in the fire for a moment, dark against the orange, and then the smoke came up and covered everything. People screamed. A few ran. Patricia, who was crouching beside Evelyn and would not leave her, put her arm around the injured woman's shoulders and said something quiet. Evelyn was looking past her, looking for Mason. But when she turned her head, all she saw was the rain. He was gone. Well, she learned later, piecing it together from people who'd been standing nearby, that he hadn't waited for the applause. He'd stood up while the car was still burning, said something to Patricia that she couldn't quite hear over the noise, and walked back toward the bridge access stairs. Not running, not rushing. Just a man in work boots and a hard hat moving through the rain with the unhurried certainty of someone who had somewhere else to be. What he'd left behind was this: a heavy canvas jacket, dark green, left across a parking meter near where he'd set her down. She hadn't noticed it in the moment. It had her blood on the collar. And it was the only thing in the world that connected Evelyn Hart, who owned buildings and companies and sat on the boards of 3 separate charitable foundations, to the man who had walked into a burning car for her and then walked away without leaving a name. 3 miles north, Mason Ryder pulled into the pickup lane of Westlake Elementary at 2 minutes to 6, rolled down his window, and waited. His arms were shaking. He'd noticed it in the truck, away from the crowd. The delayed response that always came after, the body's protest at what it had been asked to do. His left shoulder would be useless by morning. He already knew that. There was also a cut on his forearm he didn't remember getting that had bled through his shirt. He would deal with those things later. Right now, the glass doors of the school were opening, and a small figure in a yellow backpack was coming down the front steps with the particular bouncing walk of an 8-year-old who has been inside all day and wants the world to know that it's not fair. Emma Ryder spotted his truck and her whole face changed. She ran. She yanked the door open and climbed up and threw herself at him without any of the coordination you'd hope for, backpack swinging, rain-damp hair in his face, and he caught her and held on. "You're late," she announced into his shoulder. "I'm literally 2 minutes early." "You feel late." He closed his eyes. The shaking in his arms slowed, then stopped. "How was your day?" he asked. "Mrs. Pemberton gave us a surprise quiz, and I think I failed it." "Did you study?" "Nobody knew to study. That's what makes it a surprise quiz." "Fair point." She pulled back and looked at him with the particular scrutiny that 8-year-olds apply to adults who are hiding something. Her eyes were dark brown and sharp as a hawk's, and she had a way of going quiet when she was thinking that reminded him, sometimes, of someone else. And he pushed that thought away the way he always did. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I'm fine." She studied him for another second. "You look like you got wet." "It's raining. Your shirt is ripped." "I caught it on something at work." She seemed to accept this, which was the thing about Emma. She was sharp enough to notice the inconsistencies, and she trusted him enough to let them go. For now. He knew she'd come back to it later, the way she always did, circling back to the things she'd decided to think about more carefully. "Can we get pizza?" she asked. "We have food at home." "But we never get pizza." "We got pizza 2 weeks ago." "That was 2 weeks ago," she said, as if this settled the matter completely. Mason looked at his daughter, rain-damp, quiz-failed, persistent as gravity, and felt something that didn't have a clean name, something between exhaustion and a gratitude, so intense it was almost painful. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, pizza." Emma buckled her seatbelt with an efficiency that suggested she'd been prepared for victory. "Can I pick the toppings?" "You always pick the toppings." "Because I always pick better." He pulled out of the school lot and into the rain, and behind them the city's emergency channels were lighting up. And somewhere across Seattle, a news producer was watching shaky phone footage of a burning car and a man walking away, and the search for the man in the green jacket had already begun. Mason Ryder drove his daughter to pizza and said nothing about any of it. He wouldn't say anything about it. Not tonight. Tonight was Emma's, and whatever the world wanted from him could wait until tomorrow. It had always been able to wait. The green jacket sat in a clear evidence bag on Evelyn Hart's desk for 3 days before she stopped pretending it was just going to hang there as a curiosity. Her assistant, a meticulous young man named Derek, who color-coded her calendar and ironed his shoelaces, had suggested donating it to the shelter on 4th Avenue. Her head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Calloway, who didn't believe in loose ends, had suggested running it through a forensic analysis firm he knew in Bellevue. Her publicist had suggested a press photo of Evelyn holding the jacket with the caption, "Seattle's Guardian Angel." Who is he? Evelyn had told all 3 of them to leave her office and close the door behind them. She sat alone and looked at the jacket. It was a Carhartt, dark green, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for $60. The elbows were worn through to a lighter color. There was a small tear near the left pocket that had been repaired with what looked like electrical tape, badly. The collar had her dried blood on it, rust brown against the canvas, and she had not been able to make herself look at that part for very long. She was 30 years old and had run a publicly traded technology company since she was 26. She had survived a hostile board takeover, 2 SEC investigations that went nowhere, and a business press that spent considerable energy questioning whether she was too young, too female, or too aggressive to be trusted with the company her father had left her. She had made the cover of 3 different magazines in the same calendar year. She had also, at various points, eaten cereal for dinner 4 nights in a row because she forgot to tell anyone to stock the kitchen, slept in her office during a product launch, and cried in a parking garage after a board meeting because she didn't want anyone to see her. She was not, in other words, a person who fell apart over things. But she kept looking at the jacket. The police report was straightforward. Unknown male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, 6 feet or slightly above, medium build, dark hair, wearing construction site PPE consistent with crew working on the Mercer Street Bridge project. Several witnesses confirmed he had been one of the last workers to leave the site before the beam collapse. Beyond that, nothing. The bridge project was contracted through 4 separate subcontractors and employed roughly 90 workers across rotating shifts. The foreman of the crew that had been working the platform section that afternoon had told detectives that he didn't know exactly who'd still been up there when he left. Calloway had handed her this report on day 2 with his usual expression, which was the expression of a man who had decided that feelings were inefficient. "We could hire a private investigator," he said. "I know that." "You want me to make a call?" Evelyn had looked out her floor-to-ceiling window at the gray Seattle skyline and said, "Not yet." What she didn't say, what she was still working out how to say, even to herself, was that she was afraid of what a private investigator would find. Or more specifically, she was afraid that whoever this man was, he'd had very good reasons for walking away without leaving a name, and that hunting him down like a news story was exactly the wrong way to honor what he'd done. On day 4, she hired the investigator anyway. Some things are just stronger than good intentions. His name was Frank DeLuca, and he was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent most of his career being disappointed in people and had made a comfortable peace with it. He smelled like coffee and old car upholstery, and he wore the same gray blazer to every meeting. Evelyn liked him immediately, which surprised her. "Construction worker, bridge project, Mercer Street," he said, writing nothing down. "Any distinguishing details?" His voice. She paused. He was very calm. Like none of it was, he wasn't performing calm. He actually was. DeLuca looked at her. "Former military." "How do you know that?" "I don't. But you just described the way guys who've been trained under fire talk when things go wrong. Calm isn't something civilians do naturally in a burning car situation." He snapped his notebook shut, still blank. "I'll start with the subcontractor list." He came back in 9 days with a name. Mason Daniel Ryder. Age 37. 7 years as a Navy SEAL, 2 combat deployments, honorably discharged 4 years ago. Currently employed as a journeyman ironworker with Cascade Bridge and Structural, living in the Greenwood neighborhood of Seattle. Single parent to 1 daughter, Emma, age 8. No criminal record, no social media presence of any kind, paid his taxes on time. Had a library card. Evelyn read the file twice. Then she put it down and said, "He has a daughter." 8 years old, DeLuca confirmed. "Mother is not in the picture. Custody arrangement is, well, there isn't one formally, because the mother apparently left voluntarily. Mr. Ryder has had the girl on his own since she was about 4. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He walked away from that scene to pick her up from school. School records confirm she was picked up at 5:58. She looked at the file again. There was a photo, not a flattering one, pulled from an old employment ID. And it showed a man with dark, slightly too long hair and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had stopped caring what their face looked like in photos a long time ago. He was not looking at the camera so much as tolerating it. "He doesn't know we know who he is," she said. "Presumably not. I want to meet him. In person. I don't want to ambush him. I want to meet him properly." DeLuca gave her the look of a man who had seen people complicate simple things before and knew better than to get in the way. "I'll give you his worksite address." She showed up on a Thursday morning without Derek, without Calloway, without a car service. She drove herself in a gray rental sedan that nobody would look at twice, wearing jeans and a leather jacket and the least CEO-looking shoes she owned, which were still quite clearly expensive, but at least they weren't heels. She had the cut above her eyebrow taped shut with a steri strip that she'd been picking at for 2 weeks. Her left arm was still in a partial brace. The job site was a commercial build in Sodu, a warehouse conversion that smelled like concrete dust and welding flux. She checked in at the foreman's trailer and asked for Mason Ryder, and the foreman, a large, tired-looking man who introduced himself only as Thule, looked at her for a long moment before picking up his radio. She waited outside the trailer. Workers moved past her with the particular indifference of people who have real things to do. Someone was running an angle grinder somewhere behind a temporary wall. It was 48 degrees and the sky was the color of an old bruise. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on steel grating, coming down from the second level. Then he came around the side of the trailer and stopped. He looked exactly like the photo, and completely different from the photo. The photo had caught him still. In person, he moved like someone who was always slightly ready for something, weight distributed in a way that wasn't aggressive but wasn't relaxed either. He was wearing the same kind of work clothes he'd been wearing on the bridge, canvas pants, thermal under a flannel, hard hat pushed back on his head. His left shoulder, she noticed, was sitting slightly lower than his right. An old injury or a new one. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Ryder," she said. A pause. "Ms. Hart." So he knew. She wasn't sure why that surprised her. "You knew I'd find you," she said. "I figured someone would," he said. There was nothing unfriendly in his voice, but nothing that invited a long conversation either. "You want to talk?" "Yes." He looked around at the job site with the particular expression of someone calculating whether they have time for something they didn't plan for. "There's a coffee place 2 blocks down. I've got 20 minutes before I need to be back up." The coffee place was the kind that had been there for 30 years and wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. Formica tables, a laminated menu on the counter, coffee that came in a mug that was never entirely clean. Mason ordered black coffee and sat down with the posture of someone who had sat in a lot of unfamiliar rooms and learned not to let it show. Evelyn ordered the same thing she would have ordered at any other time, which was tea, and immediately felt slightly ridiculous about it. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Okay. That's it? Okay? I mean," he turned the mug on the table, once, a small gesture. "You're welcome. I'm glad you're not dead." She almost laughed. "That's a very direct way to put it." "It's a very direct situation." She looked at him. Up close, there were things the photo hadn't caught. The dark circles under his eyes that were the specific dark circles of someone who doesn't sleep enough, not because they can't, but because there aren't enough hours. The way he sat with his back to the wall and a line of sight to the door without appearing to think about it. The way he was being careful with her, not unkind, but careful. Like someone who had learned that certain situations require handling. "I want to compensate you," she said, "for what you did." He said nothing. "I spoke with my lawyers. There's a figure." "No," he said, "just that. No. Not I appreciate it, but no, not I have to think about it, not let me talk to someone. Just no, flat and final as a period at the end of a sentence." Evelyn studied him. "You didn't even hear the number." "Doesn't matter. It's a significant number." "Ms. Hart." He put both hands around the mug and looked at her directly. His eyes were dark gray, and there was something in them that reminded her of deep water. Not threatening, just deep. "I didn't go into that car for money. I went in because you were in there and the car was going to blow and I had the training to help. That's the whole reason. Putting a number on it turns it into something it wasn't." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. In her world, no one turned down significant money without a counteroffer ready. It was so outside her experience that it took her a second to recalibrate. "Then what can I do?" she asked. "Because I don't—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't do well with debts I can't pay." Something shifted in his face. Not quite softening, but something. "There's nothing to pay," he said. "It's done. You're alive. That's what mattered." "It mattered to me too," she said, which came out more raw than she intended, and she saw him notice it. She looked down at her tea. "Your daughter, Emma." He went still in a way that was almost imperceptible. "How much do you know about me?" "I hired someone. I'm sorry. I know that's—" "No, I get it." He didn't sound angry. He sounded like someone who had accepted that this was how the world worked when you intersected with someone famous enough to have investigators on retainer. "What about her?" "Nothing inappropriate, just, you left that night to pick her up from school." Someone at the scene mentioned it. "A woman named Patricia." He nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about that," Evelyn said. "You were running toward a burning car, and you were also keeping track of school pickup." Something crossed his face. Not pride exactly, more like acknowledgement of a complicated truth. "You do what you have to do. Then you do the next thing." They sat with that for a moment. The angle grinder somewhere in the distance had stopped. Rain had started on the windows. "Is there anything—" "Not for you," she said carefully. "But is there anything that the families of people in your situation actually need? Workers who are raising kids alone, dealing with injuries, not making—" She stopped herself before she said what she nearly said, which was not making enough. "I run a foundation alongside the company. I'm looking at what it actually funds and whether it's doing anything real." Mason looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense he was deciding something. "The guys I work with," he said slowly, "when someone gets hurt on a site and can't work for a few weeks, The medical gets covered, mostly, but the family doesn't. The wife who has to take time off because she's running the kids alone. The rent that comes due while the guy's in PT. The stuff that falls through the cracks of every program that technically exists to catch it. He paused. There's no fun for that. There's no... He shook his head. There's no one who thinks about the 6 weeks after the injury. Evelyn was writing nothing down. She was listening the way she listened when something was actually important. Families of construction workers, she said. Families of anyone doing physical work who can't afford to stop. He shifted. I don't know anything about how foundations work. I do, she said. He looked at her. You're going to do something with that. Yes. I'm not asking you to. I know, she said. That's actually why I'm going to. He drank his coffee. She drank her tea. Outside, the rain picked up. I have to get back, he said. Of course. She reached into her jacket pocket. Would it be all right if I called you? Not about the foundation, just... She stopped. I don't actually know how to finish that sentence. He looked at the card she was holding out. He didn't take it immediately. There was a small war going on somewhere behind his eyes that she wasn't supposed to be able to see, but could, because she had gotten very good at reading people in rooms. He took the card. I don't check my email, he said. The number's on there too. He nodded once, put the card in his chest pocket, and stood up. She stood up too. And there was a brief, slightly awkward moment where neither of them was sure what the appropriate physical gesture was. Handshake, nothing, something else. And then he simply said, "Take care of that arm," and walked out. Evelyn stood in the coffee shop for another minute, listening to the rain, and tried to remember the last time a conversation had left her feeling like she needed to sit down. She called him 11 days later. She told herself it was about the foundation. She'd been working on the structure, had a framework she wanted to run by him for accuracy, and that was true as far as it went. It was also true that she'd been thinking about what he'd said about the 6 weeks after the injury in a way that kept interrupting board meetings. He picked up on the third ring. Yeah. It's Evelyn Hart. A beat. I know. I wanted to run something by you about the foundation structure. The legal team has a draft, but I want to make sure the actual use case is accurate. Do you have a few minutes? I'm between shifts. Go ahead. She walked him through it. The emergency family fund she was proposing, direct cash assistance rather than vouchers or applications, with a turnaround time of 72 hours from request to disbursement. No proving need. No caseworker review. Just, worker is injured, family needs money to stay functional, money arrives. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. That's actually the right way to do it, he said, and she heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. A kind of surprised approval, like she'd passed a test she didn't know she was taking. I had help understanding what the need actually was. It'll get abused. Some of it, most of it won't. That doesn't bother you? I'd rather have 10% loss to bad actors than 90% of real need going unmet because the application process is humiliating. She paused. Is that the wrong answer? No, he said. It's the right answer. Most people who run things like this don't think about the humiliation part. I've been on the wrong side of it, she said, differently, but I know what it's like to ask for something and have the asking feel like a judgment. He was quiet for a moment. You don't talk like I expected you to. How did you expect me to talk? I don't know. More, a pause where she could almost hear him searching. Packaged. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she didn't manage at business dinners. I've been called worse. It wasn't an insult. I know, she said. It almost sounded like a compliment. She could hear him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but the sound a person makes when they're relaxing without meaning to. It was a small thing, barely there, and she noticed it anyway. That was the first phone call. There were more. They fell into a pattern that neither of them named or negotiated. They just started talking, the way two people sometimes do when they keep ending up at the same conversational frequency without planning it. She'd call with a foundation question that was real, but also not the only reason she was calling. He'd answer, and sometimes the question would get answered in 10 minutes, and they'd hang up, and sometimes it would get answered in 10 minutes, and then one of them would say something else, and the 10 minutes would become 40. She learned things in pieces. He had grown up in Boise. He had joined the Navy at 19 because his options at the time were limited, and the recruiter had caught him on a day when limited options felt acceptable. He had found that he was, to his own surprise, very good at being a SEAL. Not because he was reckless, but because he was the opposite. Because he had the kind of patience and problem-solving mind that translated well to high-stakes situations where panic was a liability. He had done 2 tours and come home whole in body and not entirely whole in other ways, which was common enough that he didn't talk about it as unusual. He did not talk about what had made him leave. He talked about Emma, the way people talk about the one thing they got completely right, the way she negotiated, the way she had opinions about pizza toppings with a conviction that shamed most adults, the way she'd decided at age 6 that she wanted to learn to read music and had taught herself on YouTube videos because Mason couldn't afford lessons at the time and she hadn't wanted to ask. She taught herself, Evelyn said. She doesn't like asking for things she thinks she might not get, he said. There was a flat neutrality to his voice when he said it that meant something, and she understood what it meant. The child had learned that particular habit somewhere. Does she know about me? Evelyn asked. About any of this? She knows a woman called about a charity thing, he said. She didn't ask follow-up questions, which means she's thinking about it. Smart kid. Terrifyingly smart, he said, and the way he said it was both complaint and compliment and something approaching pure wonder. They met in person for the second time 6 weeks after the coffee shop, at a foundation event she'd organized. Not a gala, not a fundraiser, but a working meeting with contractors and site foremen and the kind of people who actually knew what construction families needed. She'd asked Mason if he'd come, and after a pause he'd said yes. He showed up in the nicest clothes she'd seen on him, which were dark jeans and a button-down shirt that was ironed. And he sat through 2 hours of presentations and policy discussions with the focused silence of someone who is gathering information before deciding what to do with it. When the floor opened for comments, he said maybe 6 sentences, all of them specific, all of them things that the room hadn't thought of, and the room shifted in the way that rooms shift when someone says the thing that everyone was circling around but couldn't quite land. After, in the parking lot, she said, "You should have spoken more." I said what needed saying. You had more. Saving the rest for when it matters more. He looked at the building they'd just come from, then at her. It's a good thing you're doing. She noticed he said you and not we, and she didn't call attention to it, but she noticed. It wouldn't exist without you telling me what to do with it, she said. I told you where the hole was. You figured out how to fill it. He pulled his keys from his pocket. Emma's got a school thing Friday, science fair. She's been working on it for 3 weeks. A pause. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Evelyn looked at him in the parking lot light. This man who had held a 400-pound beam in the rain so she could live, and then walked away and gone to get his kid and ordered pizza, and apparently not told anyone. She thought about the jacket with her blood on the collar. She thought about him saying, "I'm going to get you out," in a voice that had no performance in it at all. What's her project on? Evelyn asked. He looked mildly surprised by the question. Water filtration. She wants to know how people in places without clean water could use materials they actually have access to. That's not a 3rd grade science fair project. She's in 3rd grade. Evelyn stared at him. She reads a lot, he said. Can I come? The question was out before she'd fully decided to ask it, and she watched him react. Not negatively, but with the particular carefulness of someone for whom this step meant something significant, someone who had kept his daughter separate from everything else in his life with deliberate purpose. The pause was long enough that she almost took it back. Yeah, he said finally. Okay, yeah. He drove away first, and Evelyn stood in the parking lot for a moment in the cold air, with the awareness, settled and clear, that something had shifted in a direction she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure she could undo. She wasn't sure she wanted to. The science fair was in a gymnasium that smelled like industrial cleaner and fruit punch, decorated with hand-painted banners that had the joyful sloppiness of elementary school art. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes after Mason, wearing the most casual things she owned, which still drew a few looks, and found him standing in front of a display board covered in hand-drawn diagrams and small jars of various grades of gravel and sand. Emma was standing next to the display with her hands clasped behind her back and the focused expression of someone who has rehearsed and is ready. She was small for her age, with dark eyes and dark hair, and her father's particular quality of stillness, the sense of a person who was observing more than they were showing. She looked at Evelyn. "You're the charity lady," she said. "That's me," Evelyn said. "You must be Emma. Dad says you're smart." Mason made a sound somewhere between a cough and a warning. He said that, Evelyn said. He said you ask the right questions, which is what he says about smart people. Emma turned back to her display with the efficiency of someone who has a limited window. Do you want to hear about water filtration? Evelyn sat down on the small folding chair across from the table, which required folding herself in a way that was not elegant, and said, "Tell me everything." Emma told her everything. It took 11 minutes. She covered the basic principles of sediment filtration, the use of biochar as an alternative to commercial activated carbon, the effectiveness of layered sand and gravel systems in removing particulates, and the results of her 3-week experiment using water samples from 2 different sources. She spoke with the particular breathless urgency of someone who has thought about something for a long time and finally has a willing audience. Evelyn asked 4 questions. All of them were real. When Emma was done, she looked at Evelyn with the evaluating expression of a child who takes intellectual conversation seriously. "You actually understood that," she said. "I'm not just a charity lady," Evelyn said. The corner of Emma's mouth moved. Almost a smile. Mason was watching from a few feet away with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Not quite guarded anymore, not quite open, somewhere in between, as if he was watching something happen that he'd been convinced wasn't going to happen and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the evidence. Later, after the fair, after Emma had won 2nd place and accepted this with philosophical dignity, "First place was rigged, Dad. Her mom works in the science department." The 3 of them ended up at a pizza place 6 blocks from the school, because apparently pizza was the Ryder family solution to most situations, and Evelyn discovered she didn't mind at all. She sat across from this man and his daughter in a restaurant with sticky menus and a TV playing basketball with the sound off, and she let Emma choose all the toppings, and she listened to the 2 of them argue about whether pineapple on pizza was a choice or a crime with the completely invested energy of people who had been having this debate for years and were not close to resolution. She couldn't remember the last time she'd sat somewhere this ordinary and felt this. She didn't have the word for it. Settled, present, like the room she was in was actually the room she wanted to be in. She looked at Mason across the table, and he was looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Emma, who missed nothing, very carefully did not look up from her slice. Outside, Seattle moved through its evening, and inside the restaurant, something continued in the direction it had been moving for a while now, quiet and specific, and not entirely within anyone's control. The story broke on a Tuesday, which was, in Mason's experience, the kind of day that bad things preferred. Ordinary enough that you weren't prepared, inconvenient enough to ruin the rest of the week. He found out the way he found out most things he didn't want to know. Someone else told him. Thule called at 6:40 in the morning while Mason was making Emma's lunch. And the first thing Thule said was not hello, but turn on your phone data and look at the news, which was never a good opening. Mason set down the butter knife. What happened? Someone ran the jacket, Thule said. The blood on the collar. They got a partial DNA profile, matched it to your military discharge paperwork through some database. I don't know exactly how, but there's a story. It's on 3 different sites already. Emma was at the table eating cereal, reading a library book, and pretending not to listen in the way that meant she was listening to everything. How bad? Mason said. Mason. A pause. It's bad. He stepped into the hallway. The headline, when he pulled it up, read, Billionaire CEO's mystery rescuer unmasked, decorated Navy SEAL or calculated opportunist. And beneath it, a photo. Not a good one, grainy, clearly pulled from some database, of his face, next to a photo of Evelyn at a foundation event, and a third photo of the 2 of them in the parking lot after the foundation meeting, taken from a distance, with a long lens, in the way that was legal and felt like a violation anyway. He read the first 3 paragraphs. The angle was this. Mason Ryder, former Navy SEAL, had disappeared from public life after a classified incident overseas. He had recently emerged, not coincidentally, at the center of a dramatic rescue involving Evelyn Hart, Seattle's youngest and wealthiest CEO. Since that rescue, Hart had created a multi-million-dollar foundation, and the 2 had been seen together on multiple occasions, including, the article was careful to note, a children's school event. Sources close to Hart Dynamics suggested the relationship had become personal. The implication, never stated directly but present in every sentence, was that a broke construction worker with a complicated military past had identified a target and had been playing a very long game. Mason put the phone face down on the hallway shelf. He stood there for a moment. The sounds from the kitchen were ordinary. Spoon against bowl, page turning, the refrigerator humming. He pressed his palm flat against the wall and breathed. Then he went back into the kitchen and finished making Emma's lunch. "Dad?" Emma said. "Yeah." "Your phone kept buzzing when you were in the hallway." "I know." She looked at him over her book with the dark, careful eyes that had been reading him since she was old enough to read anything. "Is it the lady? The charity lady?" He zipped Emma's lunchbox. "Her name is Evelyn." "Is it Evelyn?" "Probably not yet." He put the lunchbox in her backpack. "It's going to be a weird day, Em. If anyone at school says anything strange to you..." "Like what?" He pulled on his jacket. He was choosing words carefully, which was something Emma always noticed. "Just come find me, okay? Text me from Mrs. Pemberton's room phone if you need to." Emma put her book down entirely, which she only did when she had decided something was important. "Dad, what happened?" He looked at his daughter. 8 years old, cereal bowl in front of her, hair not quite brushed yet, library book with a spaceship on the cover. She looked very small and very serious. "Someone wrote something about me," he said, "about the accident on the bridge, and about Evelyn. It's not true what they wrote, but people are going to talk about it for a while." Emma absorbed this. "What did they say?" "That I had bad reasons for what I did." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had not yet learned to second-guess the things she knew, "That's stupid." "Yeah," he said, "it is." "Are you going to tell them that?" "I'm going to not say anything, which is usually better." Emma looked skeptical. "Why is not saying anything better?" "Because some arguments you win by not having." She thought about this for longer. "That sounds like something you'd say to avoid something." "Also sometimes that," he admitted. She went back to her cereal, which meant she'd accepted it for now and would return to it later with better questions. He drove her to school in near silence. When she got out at the drop-off, she paused with her hand on the door. "Dad, yeah, I know you're not that kind of person." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most important things. Then she closed the door and walked up the school steps without looking back. He sat in the drop-off lane until the car behind him honked. By 9 in the morning, his phone had taken on the quality of something that was trying to hurt him. He silenced it, which helped with the noise but not with the actual problem. By 10, Thule had fielded calls from 2 journalists at the job site, which required Thule to deploy his full range of expressions, including the one Mason privately thought of as the volcanic patient's face, and escort them both off the property. By noon, there were camera crews. Evelyn called at 12:17. He answered. "I'm sorry," she said. The first words, no preamble. "Don't be." "Mason, you didn't do this." "No, but my visibility did." Her voice was tight in a way he hadn't heard before, controlled, but the control was working harder than usual. "I have my PR team ready to issue a statement. I want your input on it before we put anything out." "Don't put anything out." A pause. Silence tends to read as guilt in these situations. "Silence reads as not caring what they think," he said, which is accurate. "That's..." She stopped. He could hear her in whatever room she was in, the quality of city noise behind her. "That's actually a reasonable position, but my board is going to push back." "Your board can push back all it wants. It's my name." The silence on the line was complicated. He hadn't meant it to sound as blunt as it did, but he also wasn't going to unsay it. "You're right," she said. "It's your name. I'm sorry. I just..." A breath. "I hate this. I hate that they did this. I know. I want to fix it. I know that too. And you don't want me to." He chose his next words carefully. "I don't want you to fix it by throwing money at it. That's what they're already saying about us. Paying someone to manage the story about the man who supposedly came after your money. That just confirms the frame." She was quiet. Then, "You've thought about this already." "I woke up this morning," he said. "I've been thinking since." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing. Wait it out. Let it be what it is and let people decide what they want to decide." He was standing at the back of the job site, away from the crew, looking out at the gray water of the bay. I've been in situations where the only right move was to hold position and let the thing run its course. This isn't that different. It feels different to me, she said quietly. This is your life they're writing about. They're writing a story, he said. They don't have my life. They have a photo and a theory. She said his name. Just that. Mason. And there was something in the single word, the particular way she said it, that made him grip the phone slightly tighter. Emma hasn't seen it yet, he said. She knows something's happening. She'll find out fully at some point, and we'll deal with it then. How are you dealing with it? He thought about that. I've been shot at in 3 countries, he said. This is uncomfortable, but it's not that. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's either very reassuring or very alarming. Probably both. He heard her exhale slowly. Mason, I need you to know, whatever happens with the public story, whatever the board says, whatever anyone prints, I know what you are. I watched you walk into a burning car. I know exactly what kind of person does that and what their reasons are. He didn't answer immediately. The bay was flat and gray, and a container ship was moving toward the port with the slow patience of something very large. I'll call you tonight, he said, after Emma's down. Okay, she said. I'll be up. Sit. The story metastasized the way these things do, not in one direction, but in all directions simultaneously, like a crack spreading through glass. By Wednesday, there were 4 different angles being run by 4 different outlets: the hero angle, the skeptic angle, the romance angle, and the angle that had located Mason's military service record and was now asking what classified incident meant and why he had left special operations without a public explanation. That last one was the one that kept him awake. Not because they had any real information, they couldn't, it was sealed, but because it was a thread, and threads got pulled, and the things on the other end of that particular thread were not things he had processed into something he could explain to a journalist or a judge, or anyone else. The call from the family court office came on Thursday morning. He stared at the number for a long moment before he picked up. The woman on the other end was professional and neutral in the way of someone who delivers complicated news many times a day and has learned to deliver it without inflection. There had been a filing, a petition for emergency custody review of Emma Ryder, filed by her mother. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from Friday. Mason said, "Who filed it?" The petition was filed by legal representation on behalf of Nicole Ryder, formerly Nicole Cole. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud by anyone other than Emma in 4 years. He stood in his kitchen with the phone at his ear and felt something cold move through him that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." He hung up and stood very still. Nicole had left when Emma was 4. There had been no custody battle because Nicole hadn't wanted custody. She'd been leaving a life, not just a marriage, and Emma had been part of the life she was leaving. There had been a period of cards on birthdays, then a period of cards on Christmas, then nothing. Emma had stopped expecting anything from that direction around age 6, in the quiet, resigned way of a child who has learned to close a door rather than stand in front of it waiting. Mason had never said anything critical about Nicole to Emma. He had never said much at all. When Emma asked, he said that people sometimes needed to find themselves, and that it had nothing to do with Emma, and he said it enough times that he almost believed both things simultaneously. He called his lawyer, a practical woman named Judith Crane, who had handled the original custody documentation and who answered on the first ring with the energy of someone who had already seen the news and was not surprised by this call. "I saw the petition this morning," she said. "I was waiting for you to call." "What does she have?" "The petition argues that the media attention surrounding your relationship with Evelyn Hart constitutes an unstable environment for a minor. It uses the phrase significant lifestyle disruption 3 times, which is lawyer language for we don't have much, but we have this." A pause. "It also raises questions about your fitness based on the mentions of classified military activities in recent reporting." "That's nothing. They have nothing concrete." "I know that and you know that," Judith said. "The question is whether a family court judge knows that, or whether the petitioner's attorneys find a way to make ambiguity look like evidence." "Who's her lawyer?" "Garrett Howell, of Howell and Pierce. They're a family law firm in Portland, which means someone is paying for this from outside Seattle, because Nicole doesn't have Garrett Howell money." Mason set that aside for now. "What do I need to do?" You need to document everything: Emma's school records, medical records, any teacher or counselor who can speak to her well-being. You need character witnesses who know your daily life with her, not your military service. The military angle cuts both ways, and I don't want to rely on it. And you need to come into my office tomorrow so we can go through this properly. I'll be there at 7. My office opens at 8:30. I'll be in the parking lot at 7. A small silence. I'll bring the coffee, she said. He sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Emma was at school, the TV was off, the only sound was the refrigerator and the occasional car outside. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for about 30 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself when everything was going wrong. Then he lifted his head and started making a list. He didn't tell Evelyn about the custody petition immediately. He told himself it was because he was still processing it, which was partially true. The fuller truth was that he didn't want her to do anything about it. He knew her well enough by now to know that her first instinct was to solve problems. It was a quality he genuinely respected and found genuinely maddening in equal measure. And this was a problem that her trying to solve would make worse. He also, somewhere beneath all of it, didn't want her to see how bad it was, which was an instinct he recognized and didn't like in himself. He'd been self-sufficient for so long that asking for help felt like confessing to something. She found out through her own channels 2 days later. He knew because she called at 8 in the evening after Emma was in bed, and she didn't say hello. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "I was going to." "When?" "When I had a plan." He was on the couch, the TV off, the lamp making a small circle of light. "I didn't want to come to you with a problem without already having thought through it." "That's—" She stopped, started again. "Mason, I'm not a board meeting. You don't have to present solutions before you're allowed to name problems." "I know that." "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Old habit." She let that sit. He heard her moving, the sound of somewhere other than an office, softer acoustics. He thought she might be at home. He realized he had never been to where she lived. "Tell me where you are with it," she said. He told her. All of it. The petition, Judith's assessment, the character witnesses he'd started reaching out to, the documentation he was compiling. He told it plainly, no editorializing, the way he briefed things when he needed someone to understand the actual situation rather than a managed version of it. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about her. She listened completely. When he was done, she said, "I want to be a character witness." "No." "Mason, it hands them exactly what they want. The entire petition is built around you. Me bringing you into the courtroom confirms the frame. That my life has been disrupted by a billionaire. That Emma's environment is now defined by celebrity and money and media. We prove the opposite by keeping you out of it." The silence was long. "That makes strategic sense," she said. "I hate it, but it makes sense." "I know. So I just sit here." "Yes." Another silence. "I'm not good at sitting." "I know that too." "Tell me something I can actually do," she said. "Not for the case. For you." He thought about that. The lamp made its small circle. Outside, a car went by with music going. "Nothing," he said. "Just this. This is actually something." She understood what he meant. He could tell because she didn't push past it. They talked for another 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or media. Emma's latest argument about whether homework on weekends was constitutional, a problem with the foundation's payment processing that Evelyn was annoyed about. A book Mason had started reading for the first time in 2 years because Emma had left it on the couch, and he'd picked it up and somehow read 4 chapters. "What book?" she asked. "Something about a polar expedition that went wrong," he said. 1900 and something. "Do they make it?" "I'm not finished yet." "I know the book," she said. "They don't." He laughed. It was quiet and real, and it surprised him slightly. "Thanks for that. You'd have found out in 2 chapters anyway." When they said goodnight, she said, "Mason," and then didn't say anything else for a second. "Yeah," he said. "Don't do the thing where you disappear into it alone." He knew what she meant. The seal habit. The belief, bone deep, that bringing someone else into a problem was the same as weakness. That real strength meant absorbing everything without passing it. He knew it was a limited way of thinking. He'd known it for a while. Knowing something and changing it were two different countries. I'll try, he said. That's a low bar. I know. I'll take it, she said, and hung up. Whoa. Nicole arrived in Seattle 10 days before the hearing. Mason knew because Emma's school called him at 2 in the afternoon to report that a woman identifying herself as Emma's mother had come to the front office asking to sign Emma out early. The school had confirmed his standing instructions. No unauthorized pickups, ever, period. Call him immediately if anyone tried. And had declined to release Emma. The woman had left without incident. Mason was off the job site and in his truck in 4 minutes. He didn't go to the school. Emma was safe. The school had it handled. But he sat in the parking lot of a hardware store 3 blocks away for a moment because his hands were shaking, and he didn't want to drive when his hands were shaking. Not fear, rage. The specific, cold, focused rage of someone who had been willing to let the past stay in the past and had just watched the past show up at his daughter's school. He called Judith. She came to the school, he said. Judith's voice went flat and efficient. Did she take Emma? No, school turned her away. Good. Call the school back and make sure they have documentation of the attempt. I'll contact Howell's office and make clear that any contact with Emma outside of court-ordered arrangements is a violation we will bring before the judge. She doesn't have court-ordered arrangements. There's no agreement. Exactly, Judith said, which means she has no legal right to contact with Emma at all pending the hearing. Document everything. He documented everything. He wrote up the incident with the timestamps and the names of the school staff involved with the efficiency of someone who had written military incident reports and knew that details mattered. He emailed it to Judith before he left the hardware store parking lot. Then he went and picked Emma up from school at the normal time, and Emma came down the steps with her yellow backpack and her library book and did not know anything unusual had happened, and he was grateful for that and furious on her behalf simultaneously. She said, on the way home, "Can we get Thai food?" "We literally got Thai food 2 days ago." "That was 2 days ago," she said. Same argument, different cuisine. He pulled into the Thai place on Stoneway because he was not capable of saying no to his daughter on a day when he had spent 20 minutes in a parking lot controlling his hands. Over pad CEBU that Emma ate with scientific thoroughness, she said, without looking up. "Are things getting worse?" He took a moment. "Why do you ask?" "You have the face." "What face?" "The face you have when you're holding something." She ate a piece of broccoli. "You've had it for a few days." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and something that was entirely her own, a quality of precision, of naming things clearly and without drama. "There's going to be a court thing," he said. She looked up. "About custody," he said, "about where you live and who's responsible for you legally. It's a formality, mostly. You're not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. But there's a hearing, and I wanted you to know." Emma was very still. "Is it because of the news stuff?" "Yes. Someone is using it as a reason." "Who?" He held her gaze. "Your mom filed it." The word mom sat in the air between them in a complicated way. Emma's face went through several things in rapid succession, and then it settled into the particular stillness that he recognized as her processing face, the one she used when something hurt, and she was deciding what to do with the hurt. "She doesn't want me," Emma said. Not as a complaint, as a fact she had long ago filed away in a place she tried not to open. "I don't know what she wants," Mason said honestly. "Is she going to take me away?" "No." He said it with the full certainty he actually felt, which was considerable. "She is not going to take you anywhere." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her food. He waited. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "I trust you," she said simply. As if this settled it. As if trust was the whole equation and the rest was details. He gripped the edge of the table so she wouldn't see his hand. The week before the hearing was the worst one. 2 more outlets picked up the story and added new details. One of them had located a former military contact who spoke anonymously about Mason's final deployment, using the kind of language that was technically accurate and deeply misleading, suggesting instability, suggesting a man who had not come home whole. His former teammates, the ones still active, the ones who couldn't go on record, the ones who knew exactly what had happened and why, read these articles and said nothing publicly because they couldn't. and that silence read as confirmation to people who didn't know what military silence actually meant. Evelyn called him every evening. She never asked how he was doing in a way that required a performed answer. She'd learned early that he didn't do performed answers. But she asked specific questions about specific things that made it possible to actually talk. How did the meeting with Judith go? What did the teachers say when they wrote the statements? Does Emma know the hearing date? Has she asked questions? He answered all of them. One night he told her something he hadn't told anyone outside the military. Not all of it, not the details that were sealed and would stay sealed, but the outline of it. The mission that had gone wrong. The people he hadn't been able to bring home. The way he'd left the service, not because he'd broken, but because he'd looked at what it would require to keep going and decided that Emma needed the rest of him more than the Navy did. Evelyn listened. She didn't say it wasn't his fault. She didn't say he was brave. She said, "You made the choice that made you someone Emma could actually have." He hadn't thought about it in exactly those words before. "That's one way to see it," he said. "It's the right way," she said. "The other framing is what the article is using, and the article is wrong." He didn't argue with her. There were things he still blamed himself for that she didn't know about, that the right framing didn't change. But the way she said it, with the directness of someone who had thought about it and arrived at a conclusion rather than someone reaching for comfort, settled something that had been loose. On the morning of the hearing, Mason put on the same clothes he'd worn to the foundation meeting, the dark jeans, the ironed button-down, and took Emma to school and told her he'd be there at pickup, and she said okay and went inside. He drove to the courthouse. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he saw Nicole for the first time in 3 years. She looked the way people look when they've been living hard and dressing well to compensate. Expensive coat, careful makeup, something behind the eyes that the coat and the makeup couldn't quite cover. She was with 2 attorneys, and she didn't look at him when he came around the corner, which meant she'd seen him first and had a moment to decide not to look. Her lead attorney, Howell, the Portland import, was a man in his 50s with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to seem likable and was not. He nodded at Mason with professional neutrality. Mason did not nod back. Judith appeared at his elbow. "Don't engage," she said quietly. "Not with him, not with her. We go in, we present, we let the record speak." "I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him with the frank appraisal she'd had since their first meeting. "You look good, like a person who has nothing to hide, which is the correct look." "I have nothing to hide." "Better," she said. They went in. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named the Honorable Patricia Wynne. Not the same Patricia as the parking lot, a coincidence that meant nothing, though his brain noted it, who had the demeanor of someone who had been in family court long enough to have heard every human story at least twice and was not here for theater. Howell went first. He laid out the petition with smooth competence. The media storm, the disrupted environment, the unresolved questions about Mason's military record, the presence in Emma's life of a high-profile public figure whose own judgment and lifestyle introduced instability. He used the word instability 7 times. He used the phrase Emma's best interests 14 times, which Mason counted, because counting things was something he did when he needed to stay contained. Then Judith went. She called the first witness, who was Mrs. Pemberton, Emma's teacher, a woman of 52 who had been teaching 3rd grade for 24 years and had the unshakable authority of someone who had spent 2 decades managing rooms full of small people and their complicated parents. She spoke about Emma's academic performance, her social development, her emotional stability, the consistency of Mason's involvement in her schooling. She spoke about pickup times, about the parent-teacher conferences he had never missed, about the way Emma talked about her father. Howell cross-examined. He asked whether Mrs. Pemberton had noticed any changes in Emma's behavior since the media attention began. Mrs. Pemberton said, "Emma Ryder is one of the most grounded children I've taught in 24 years. Whatever is happening in the news has not touched what happens at her desk every morning. I believe that speaks to the environment she comes home to." Howell tried a follow-up. Mrs. Pemberton looked at him with the expression of a woman who had dealt with difficult parents for 2 decades and was not remotely intimidated. He moved on. The second witness was Carl Oduya, a fellow worker from Mason's crew who had known him for 3 years, a man with a wife and 3 kids of his own who spoke about Mason with the blunt, honest quality of someone who is not performing a friendship but describing one. He talked about the lunches Mason ate at the site because he was saving money. He talked about the time Mason had spent 2 weeks of lunch breaks helping Carl learn a software program the crew was being forced to adopt because Carl was slower with it and didn't want to fall behind. He talked about the school play, the soccer practices, the way Mason reorganized his entire schedule when Emma had been sick for 2 weeks in February. Then Judith called Mason himself. He took the stand with the posture he'd been trained into, spine straight, hands still, eyes on whoever was speaking, calm without affectation. Judge Wynn looked at him with the evaluating steadiness of someone who had been looking at people on witness stands for a long time. Judith's questions were surgical. She didn't ask him to perform. She asked him to explain. He explained his daily schedule. The logistics of single parenting on a construction worker's salary in a Seattle real estate market that was actively hostile to people who earned what he earned, the way he'd arranged Emma's school, her health care, her activities, the way he talked to her about hard things, including the things that were hard right now. "Did you tell Emma about the custody petition?" Judith asked. "Yes." "What did you tell her?" "That there was a court process, that it involved her mom, that she wasn't going anywhere, and that I would be honest with her about what happened." He paused. "She asked if her mom was going to take her. I told her no." "How did she respond?" "She said okay." He stopped. "She said she trusted me." The courtroom was very quiet. Howell's cross-examination went after the media story, went after Evelyn, went after the sealed military record. Mason answered every question with the same even, direct quality. Not aggressive, not evasive, not performing humility, just present. Howell was good. Mason had been in interrogations. He answered what was asked and nothing extra. Then Howell made the mistake of asking about the night on the bridge. "Mr. Ryder, isn't it true that your current relationship with Ms. Hart began because you deliberately inserted yourself into a dangerous situation in order to make contact with a high-profile individual?" Judith said, "Objection." Judge Wynn said, "I'll allow it. Mr. Ryder, you can answer." Mason looked at Howell. "There was a woman trapped in a car with a ruptured fuel line," he said. "The car was going to ignite. I had training that the other bystanders didn't have. I went in because she was going to die if I didn't. I didn't know who she was. I don't know what I would have done differently if she'd been someone without money." He paused. "My daughter from school. Ms. Hart found me. I didn't ask her to." Howell looked at his notes. The pause lasted long enough to mean something. "No further questions," he said. Judge Wynn called a recess. In the hallway, Judith said, "You did well." "I told the truth." "Those aren't always the same thing in here," she said. "Today they were." Mason stood in the courthouse hallway and felt the particular hollowness of someone who has been running on adrenaline and is now waiting for the ground to either hold or give way. The marble floor was cold-looking under fluorescent light. Somewhere down the hall, Nicole was with her attorneys in a conference room, and he didn't feel what he thought he'd feel standing this close to the person who had left. He felt tired. He felt the accumulated weight of the past 3 weeks and the 4 years before that, and underneath all of it, the steady fixed point of Emma at her desk in Mrs. Pemberton's classroom, reading a book about something she'd decided to understand. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Evelyn. 3 words. "I'm out front." He stared at the message. He had told her not to come. She had come anyway, but she'd stopped at the steps. Not pushing past the boundary he'd set, but not being nowhere either. Present at the edge of it, where she could be found if he needed her and not in the way if he didn't. He typed back, "Hearing's not over." She replied, "I know. I brought bad coffee. Take your time." He put the phone in his pocket. Judith came back around the corner. "They're calling us back in." He nodded and followed her toward the courtroom doors, and somewhere between the hallway and the doors he found the steadiness he needed. Not confidence exactly, not the absence of fear, but the thing he'd learned a long time ago in worse places than this. That you move forward not because you're certain of the outcome, but because moving forward is the only honest answer to the question the moment is asking. He went back in. Judge Wynn returned to the bench 12 minutes after recess ended, which was fast enough that Judith leaned slightly toward Mason and said quietly, "That's a good sign. Long deliberations in chambers mean complexity. Short ones usually mean clarity." Mason said nothing. He was watching the judge the way he watched everything in situations that mattered, with the focused stillness of someone who had learned that the most important information is often in the thing that happens before the thing happens. Judge Wynne settled her papers, looked at both tables, and began. She spoke for 9 minutes. Mason tracked the language carefully. Family court decisions came in the grammar of their qualifications, in what the judge chose to emphasize and what she chose to pass quickly over. Wynne was precise. She acknowledged the petition, acknowledged the legitimate procedural right of any parent to bring one, and then proceeded to dismantle it with the methodical patience of someone who had no interest in being dramatic about it. The media attention, she said, did not constitute an unstable environment. The record before her showed consistent school attendance, strong academic performance, documented participation in extracurricular activities, and testimony from a 24-year teaching veteran describing the child as one of the most grounded she had encountered in her career. If that was instability, Judge Wynne said, with a dryness that had clearly been refined over years of family court practice, she would welcome more of it. The questions about Mason's military record, she continued, were not before this court. Sealed records were sealed for reasons that did not require explanation in a custody proceeding. What was before this court was the daily reality of Emma Ryder's life, and that reality, as documented and testified to, showed a child who was safe, loved, challenged, and consistent. The standard for emergency custody modification required clear evidence of harm or imminent risk. That evidence was not present. Petition denied. Howell made a brief notation. Nicole, 2 seats down from him at the petitioner's table, looked at the surface of the table. Mason did not look at her. Judith put her hand briefly on his forearm, not celebratory, just acknowledgement, and then began gathering her files with the efficiency of someone who had many more cases and no time to linger in the ones that resolved. Mason sat for a moment after the gavel came down. The courtroom was already shifting around him, the clerk moving, Howell and his associate beginning a murmured conversation, a bailiff near the door checking his phone. He sat in the middle of all that movement and felt the particular silence that follows a thing you've been bracing for, when the bracing is over and the body doesn't quite know what to do with the energy it was saving. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. She was on the courthouse steps. Not in the way of someone who had pushed past a boundary, but in the way of someone who understood that being present at the edge of things was different from being in the middle of them. She was standing slightly to the side of the main doors, a coffee cup in each hand, wearing a coat that was losing a small battle with the November wind. She looked cold and entirely unbothered by being cold. When he came through the doors, she looked at him, and the question was in her eyes before she asked it. "Denied," he said. She closed her eyes for half a second. Then she held out one of the coffees. He took it. It was, as advertised, bad, thin and slightly burnt, and from the vending machine in the courthouse lobby, which she had apparently located and used with no apparent shame. "This is terrible," he said. "I know. I couldn't find anywhere else." She looked at him. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." He drank the coffee anyway. "Yeah, I am." They stood on the courthouse steps in the wind, and she didn't try to make it into anything more than what it was, which was 2 people standing somewhere cold after something hard, and he appreciated that more than he could have explained. "Emma," she said, "I'll call the school. Tell her when I pick her up." "What will you tell her?" "That it's over. That she's home." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "She'll want to know what happened to her mother." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What did happen to her?" He looked out at the street below the steps. Traffic moved. Someone walked a dog past the base of the stairs, the dog pulling toward a planter with the focused urgency of a dog that has found something important. "She left without talking to me." Howell and her other attorney escorted her out a side door, which is probably good for both of us. "Did you want to talk to her?" He thought about that honestly. "No, I wanted to ask her why she showed up at Emma's school, but I don't think the answer would help anything." "No," Evelyn said, "it probably wouldn't." He looked at her. She was watching the street too, and her profile in the gray morning light was familiar to him now, in the way that things become familiar when you've been paying attention to them for a while without quite admitting that's what you're doing. "You came," he said. "You told me not to." "I know." "You told me not to come inside," she said. "You didn't say anything about the steps." She said it without apology and without performance, the way she said most true things. He looked at her for a moment. There was something gathering in his chest that he'd been aware of for a while and had been treating with the kind of deliberate inattention you apply to things you're not ready to name. "Thank you," he said, "for bad courthouse coffee." "For the steps," he said. She looked at him. Something shifted between them in the wind, quiet and significant. Then she said, "Let's get you out of the cold," and they walked down the steps together. He picked Emma up at the normal time, and she came down the front steps of the school and looked at his face and read it the way she always read him, quickly and with accuracy. "Good?" she said. "Good," he said. She nodded once, put her backpack in the back seat, and got in with the efficient movements of a person who has been waiting all day for news and is now releasing the tension of waiting. He drove 2 blocks before she spoke. "She left?" "Her lawyers took her, yes." "Is she going to try again?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I don't think so, but I can't promise." Emma looked out the window. "Why did she do it?" "I don't know, Em. I really don't." She was quiet through 2 traffic lights. Then, "It's not because of Evelyn, is it? That's just what they said." He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Like, they used Evelyn as a reason, but that's not actually why she did it." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has thought something through to the end. "She did it because of something else. Maybe because the news made her think about us and I don't know." She went quiet. "I don't think she did it because she wants me." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. He turned onto their street. "You might be right," he said. "Is that a bad thing to say?" "It's an honest thing. Those aren't always the same." He pulled into the driveway and turned the car off, and they sat in it for a moment. "You can feel however you feel about her, Em. There's no wrong way." Emma looked at her hands in her lap. "I don't feel much," she said. "Is that okay?" "Yes," he said. "That's okay." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes. "Can Evelyn come for dinner sometime? Not tonight, but sometime." He looked at his daughter. "She's not that bad," Emma said, which from Emma was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. "I'll ask her," he said. "Tell her I picked the toppings." "She knows," he said. The media narrative didn't collapse so much as lose interest in itself, which is how these things usually end. Not with a correction or an apology, but with the next story pulling attention away, like a current pulling a boat. Within 10 days of the hearing, the court's dismissal of the custody petition had been reported briefly and without fanfare, and then the outlets that had run the original story moved on to other things. The framing that had called Mason a fortune hunter couldn't survive contact with a family court record that showed, in plain documented language, a man who had been doing the hard and unglamorous work of raising a child alone and doing it well. What remained was something quieter. A few of Mason's former teammates, men he hadn't spoken to in over a year, men who existed in the sealed part of his past, started reaching out. Not publicly, not through press channels, but directly, the way those men communicated when they wanted to. A text from a number he still had saved, an email with no subject line, a voicemail left at 2 in the morning because of time zone math that was not quite right. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. What they said, in various forms and with the particular economy of men who had learned not to waste words, was, "We know who you are. The record might be sealed, but we know what happened, and we know why you left, and we know what kind of soldier you were." He didn't respond to all of them. He responded to a few. Those conversations were short and oddly relieving in the way that only conversations with people who already know the whole story can be. Thule, who knew none of the military details and had never asked, took him out for lunch at a Filipino place in the International District and ordered enough food for 4 people and said, halfway through, "You good?" "Yeah," Mason said. "Emma good?" "Yeah." Thule nodded and ate his pancit, and that was the entirety of the debrief. Mason had always appreciated that about Thule. He invited Evelyn for dinner on a Thursday, because Thursday was the night Emma didn't have any after-school activities, and Mason got home early enough to actually cook something rather than defaulting to pizza or Thai food. Emma had specified that Evelyn should be told about the topping situation, and Evelyn had texted back, "Noted. I will defer to the Senior Toppings Authority," which Mason had read to Emma, who had nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has established the correct pecking order. He made spaghetti, which was something he actually knew how to do. Not a showpiece dinner, Just food, the kind that filled the kitchen with a smell that made a house feel like people lived in it. Emma set the table with the irregular attention to detail of a child who cared about the general concept of doing it right and less about the specifics. Evelyn arrived 7 minutes early, which he was learning was her version of being on time. She ran fast, slightly, as if she was always compensating for something. She was carrying a bag that turned out to contain a baguette she'd stopped for on the way because she'd asked Derek what you brought to someone's house for dinner. And Derek had said wine or bread, and she decided on bread because she didn't know if Emma could have wine, which she told Mason in the kitchen while he was draining pasta, and it made him laugh unexpectedly. "She's 8, he said. "I know, I wanted to be sure." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the bread. "What kind is it?" "Sourdough," Evelyn said. "I like sourdough," Emma said, as if this were a point in Evelyn's favor she was officially recording. Dinner was loud in this way that dinners with Emma tended to be loud. Not chaotic, but full. Emma operating at the particular volume of a child who has things to say and a deadline of bedtime. She told Evelyn about the water filtration project update she was planning, about a disagreement she was having with a classmate named Ryan over the correct pronunciation of a word in a book they were both reading, about the specific injustice of surprise quizzes as an assessment method. Evelyn engaged with all of it, not indulgently, not in the careful way of adults performing interest in children, but actually. She had an argument about the surprise quiz that Emma hadn't considered, which Emma rejected after genuine deliberation, and then came back to 20 minutes later and reconsidered. Watching them, Mason ate his spaghetti and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. After dinner, after Emma had extracted a promise that Evelyn would look at the updated filtration diagrams before she left, Emma went to do her reading before bed. Mason and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with tea, real tea this time, not vending machine anything, and the house was quiet in the easy way it sometimes got when the day had gone the way it was supposed to. "She's extraordinary," Evelyn said. "I know." He said it without false modesty because it was simply true. "You did that." "She did that," he said. "I just kept the roof over it." Evelyn looked at him. "That's more than you think it is." He turned his mug. "She asked me if you could come to dinner, before I asked you." Something moved through Evelyn's face. Not surprise exactly. Emma had been warming toward her in the methodical way that Emma did everything, and Evelyn had been paying attention. But something. "She did?" "She said, and I'm quoting, that you're not that bad." Evelyn looked at her tea for a moment. "That might be the best review I've ever gotten." "Coming from Emma, it is." She looked up at him. The kitchen lamp made a warm circle around the table, and outside the window the neighborhood was doing its evening things. Someone walking a dog, a car going slowly past. He had sat at this table 10,000 times, alone, and with Emma, and without anyone else. And tonight it felt different in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. Just different, like a room that has been rearranged and you're noticing the new proportions. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. He had been thinking about this for a long time, and like most things he thought about for a long time, the actual saying of it was less complicated than the thinking. "Whatever this is," he said, "whatever it's been turning into, I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this part. I'm better at knowing what I feel than saying it in a way that sounds like how I feel." "You're doing fine," she said. "I've been letting things develop without naming them," he said, "which is a habit of mine, but I think it's not fair to you, given—" He gestured slightly at the room, at the house, at the fact of Emma down the hall. "Given what's here." She was very still and very focused, in the way she got when something actually mattered. "I want this," he said. "All of it. Not the version of it where you're a person I call at night and see at events. The version where you're—" He couldn't find the word that wasn't either too much or not enough. "The version where you're in it." She looked at him for a moment. "In it," she said. "Yeah." "That's not the most romantic declaration I've ever received," she said. "I know. It might be the most honest." "I was going for honest." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hand was warm and her grip was stronger than people would expect from looking at her, and he had the thought, sidelong and clear, that she had been holding things together with those hands for a long time and had never stopped being capable of it. "I'm in it," she said. "I've been in it. I just didn't want to push past what you were ready for." "I know." he said. I know you didn't. You needed time. I always need time. I know that too, she said. I have time. He turned his hand under hers. They sat like that for a moment in the kitchen, and it wasn't a scene from a movie. There was a pasta pot still on the stove that needed washing, and the table had breadcrumbs on it, and somewhere down the hall Emma was probably reading past her bedtime. But it was real, which was better. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before them. Not easily. Nothing about life with a child and two demanding careers and the ongoing project of learning how another person actually worked was easy, but with the specific forward motion of something that has found its direction. Evelyn began restructuring heart dynamics in earnest. She had been thinking about it for months, in the way she thought about hard things, circling, examining from multiple angles, waiting until she was sure. The company was sound, was profitable, was doing the work it was supposed to do. What it had become was a machine that required her total and continuous presence to function, and she had built it that way, she acknowledged to herself, partly because being required was a way of not noticing that you were also alone. She began hiring people who could own pieces of it, not delegating in the way executives delegate when they don't really trust anyone, actually handing over authority, actually stepping back. It was uncomfortable in the specific way that useful things are uncomfortable. She made mistakes. She hired one person who turned out to be wrong for the role and spent 3 months being diplomatic about fixing it. She overcorrected on one decision and undercorrected on another. She talked to Mason about some of it. Not for his business advice, his instincts about business were sound, but she wasn't looking for a consultant. But because he was one of the few people she could talk to about the uncomfortable parts without managing how it sounded. He had a quality of listening that was different from most people. He didn't process what she said into something he could respond to while she was still saying it. He just listened. And then he said the one thing, if there was one thing, rather than everything he thought. She told him once, after a particularly difficult board conversation, I keep feeling like I should already be better at this. Better at what? Letting go of things. Trusting other people to handle them. He considered this. How long did it take you to build the company into something you had to hold completely alone? Years. Okay, he said, so it might take more than 4 months to learn to hold it differently. She had been expecting something more complicated. That's it? That's it, he said. You're not slow. The timeline is just honest. She thought about that for days. It was the kind of thing that seemed simple, but had actual weight to it, and she turned it over in her mind in the in-between moments, on her way into buildings, in the car between meetings. The timeline is just honest. She said it to herself sometimes when she was being impatient with her own progress, which was frequent. The foundation moved forward with the efficiency of something that had been designed correctly from the start. The Emergency Family Fund processed its first 43 disbursements in the second month of operation, averaging 61 hours from request to payment. The abuse rate, applications that didn't reflect genuine need, was lower than anyone had projected. Evelyn had predicted this, based on the observation that people who are actually in crisis don't typically have the bandwidth for elaborate fraud. The board of the foundation disagreed with her on several implementation details and was right about 2 of them, which she acknowledged at the next meeting without drama. Mason came to one foundation board meeting, just one, and not as anything official. Evelyn had asked him to sit in as a practical advisor, someone who could tell them when their language was drifting away from the reality it was supposed to address, which happened in nonprofit boards with the regularity of a natural phenomenon. He sat at the back of the room, in the clothes he wore to everything, and twice during the meeting he said something brief and specific that changed the direction of the conversation. The board members, who were a mix of corporate executives and nonprofit professionals, and one retired firefighter, received his input with the particular attention people give to someone who clearly knows what he's talking about and is not trying to impress them. Afterward, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who ran the foundation's community outreach program, found him by the coffee station and said, "You should be on the board." Mason looked at her. "I'm a construction worker." "That's exactly why," she said. He didn't say yes, but he thought about it, which was a thing he would not have done 6 months earlier. Emma's relationship with Evelyn developed with the same methodical quality Emma brought to everything she decided to take seriously. She did not warm to people quickly or entirely. She observed, She tested in small ways that were usually invisible. Unless you were paying attention, she reserved judgment. With Evelyn, the testing had been the science fair. Evelyn had passed by asking real questions, and Emma had logged that and begun adjusting her assessment accordingly. By December, Emma was calling Evelyn by her first name without the formal weight it had carried in the beginning. She had opinions about Evelyn's work schedule, which she expressed with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some opinions are better kept internal. She told Evelyn once, on a car ride to Emma's soccer practice, Evelyn had offered to take her because Mason was stuck at the site, that she worked too much. "I'm working on that," Evelyn said. "Dad says that too," Emma said. "And then he does it anyway." "Your dad works hard because of you," Evelyn said. Emma thought about this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "I know, but I'd rather have him home for dinner than have everything else." Evelyn drove and said nothing for a moment. "You can tell him that," Emma said. "He won't mind me saying it. I think he knows." "Knowing and changing are different," Emma said, with the serene confidence of someone who has absorbed a piece of adult wisdom and deployed it back. It was something Mason had said to her, Evelyn realized. She had heard him say almost exactly that phrase in a different context. Emma collected true things and kept them. "You're right," Evelyn said. "They are different." Emma nodded as if this was settled, and looked out the window, and the matter was apparently closed. That night, after Evelyn had dropped Emma at practice and gone back to her own apartment, she sat in her kitchen, a kitchen that was well-designed and well-stocked and felt, at this time of evening, like a room waiting to be used, and thought about the child's 9 words. "I'd rather have him home for dinner than have everything else." The clarity of it. The way a child's clarity lands differently than an adult's because there is no strategy in it, no management of how it sounds, just the direct statement of what is true and what is wanted. She thought about what she had been building toward for 3 years. The company, the recognition, the particular form of power that came from being very good at a very hard thing. She thought about what she was building now, which was different and not yet named, but was taking shape with the specific solidity of something built on actual materials. She called Mason. He picked up. "Hey." "Emma told me I worked too much," she said. A pause. "Yeah?" She said knowing and changing are different. A longer pause, and then a sound that was clearly him trying not to laugh. "She's been saving that one." "She heard it from you." "I know where she heard it." He was quiet for a second. "Are you okay?" Yes. Yes. I just wanted to tell you that I'm going to come to more dinners." Okay. "And I'm going to be better about the work thing. Not perfect. I know what I'm like. But better." "I'm not asking you to be different," he said. "You know that." "I know. I'm asking myself." She looked at her kitchen. "I have a very nice kitchen that no one eats in." "What do you mean?" "I mean..." She stopped, started again. "I have a life that I built to prove things, and it proves them, and now I'm 30 years old and my kitchen is for decoration." She said it without self-pity, just as an observation, the way she named things that needed naming. "I want to cook dinner for people. I want Emma to do homework at my table. I want..." She stopped. "Evelyn," he said. "I want what you have," she said. Which is funny because most people look at what you have and see what's missing. The line was quiet for a moment. "It's not easy," he said. "I know that. There are days when it's not the version people imagine." "I know what the real version is," she said. "I've been in it. The pasta pot on the stove and the breadcrumbs on the table and Emma reading past her bedtime. That's the version I want." He didn't say anything for a long time. She waited. "Come to dinner Friday," he said. "Emma's been working on an update to the filtration project. She wants a witness." Evelyn smiled. "I'll be there at 7. Not 6:53. "I cannot make promises about 6:53. 7, he said. 7, she agreed, and she was still smiling when she hung up. Christmas came the way it always did in Seattle, with more rain than snow, with the city doing its best impression of festivity under perpetually gray skies. Mason had never been a big Christmas person, not because he objected to it, but because the holiday required a certain amount of ceremony that he had never quite worked out how to generate on his own. He and Emma had their traditions. The tree that was always slightly crooked, the specific ornaments Emma had an assigned attachment to, The Christmas morning pancakes that she rated on a rubric she had developed herself at age 6 and maintained with complete seriousness. And those traditions were good. They were theirs. This year, Evelyn came on Christmas Eve. She came with wrapped gifts that she had clearly thought about, which Emma assessed with the critical eye of an appraiser. There was a set of water quality testing equipment for Emma's ongoing project, not a toy version, an actual kit, the kind used in field research, which Emma held with the expression of someone who has just received the exact right thing and knows it. There was a book for Mason about a mountaineering expedition that had gone badly in the 1950s, which he turned over in his hands with the particular quiet pleasure of someone who has been thinking about what to read next. "How did you know?" he said. "You mentioned the Polar Expedition book. I looked at what you'd said about it and found a pattern." She said it simply. She paid attention, and she wasn't pretending she didn't. Emma, who had returned to the testing kit and was reading the instructions with intense focus, said without looking up, "You got the right things. Usually people get the wrong things." "That's a compliment," Mason told Evelyn. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'll take it." They made dinner together. Not beautifully, not without the specific friction of two people learning to share a kitchen, Mason moving in ways that assumed one set of organizational logic, and Evelyn having a different set, and neither of them being quite wrong. Evelyn burned one thing, slightly. Mason forgot he'd left something in the oven, and it came out overcooked on one side. Emma ate both things without complaint and told them diplomatically that the texture was interesting. After Emma was in bed, later than usual, because it was Christmas Eve and the rules had different hours, they sat in the living room with the crooked tree lit and the rain on the windows and the particular quiet of a house with a child in it who is asleep. Evelyn looked at the tree. "It lists to the left," she said. "It always does," Mason said. "Emma says it has character." "She's right." He looked at the tree too. The lights were the old-fashioned kind, big bulbs in different colors, the kind that had been in a box in his closet since before Emma was born. They made the room warm in an uneven way. "This is a good Christmas," he said. It came out more simply than he intended, but he meant it completely. Evelyn looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "it is." They were sitting close on the couch, the kind of close that happens gradually and without announcement, and the tree lights made their small colored patches on the wall, and the rain continued outside. She leaned slightly into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that for a while, not talking, the house doing its quiet overnight things around them. It was not perfect. His shoulder still ached when the weather turned. He still sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with the specific clarity of a bad dream he couldn't remember. Evelyn still sometimes checked her phone in the middle of conversations and had to actively correct herself. Emma had moods that were dark and specific and required patience he occasionally ran short on. None of it was smooth. But there was something here, something he could feel in the weight of her against his side, in the sound of Emma's breathing down the hall, in the crooked tree with its big colored lights, something he had stopped believing he'd find, somewhere in the years between the Navy and the bridge and all the long nights in between. Something that was made of ordinary, imperfect, real things, and was more solid because of it. He had learned, in a life that had asked a great deal of him in the matter of strength, that the hardest thing was not the weight of the beam or the heat of the fire or the 3 a.m. clarity of a bad dream. The hardest thing was learning to hold something good without waiting for it to be taken. He was learning. Outside, the rain kept on, and the city turned through its night, and inside the house with the crooked Christmas tree, Mason Ryder sat with the woman he loved, and the knowledge that his daughter was asleep in her room, and let himself have it, just that, just the having of it, without waiting for the other thing to come. The anniversary came on a Thursday, which meant Mason had work in the morning, and Emma had school, and the day began exactly the way most important days begin, without ceremony, without any external signal that this particular rotation of the earth meant something different from the one before it. He had been thinking about it for weeks, not obsessively, not in the way he used to think about the things that haunted him. That was a different quality of thought, darker and circular. But with the steady, deliberate attention he gave to things he was planning, he knew what he wanted to do. He had known for a while. The question had never been what, only when, and when had arrived. He told Emma at breakfast. She was eating toast and reading the same library book she'd been working through for 4 days, which meant it was either very long or she was savoring it, and she looked up when he sat down across from her with the expression she used when she understood that something was about to be said that required her full attention. "I want to take you somewhere after school today," he said, "and Evelyn's going to meet us there." Emma put the book down. "Where?" "The bridge," he said. "The Mercer Street Bridge." She was quiet for a moment. She knew the story. She'd known the broad version for almost a year, learned it the way children learn the significant events of their parents' lives, in pieces and at angles, never all at once. She knew a beam had fallen. She knew Mason had gone in. She knew that Evelyn had been inside the car. "Why?" she asked. He thought about how to say it. "Because a year ago something happened in a place, and that place turned into where we are now. And I want to go back there and, I don't know, close the loop, mark it." Emma looked at him with the evaluating steadiness she'd had since she was small. "Are you going to ask her something?" He held his daughter's gaze. She was 9 now, had turned 9 in October with the same matter-of-fact approach she brought to most milestones, pleased but not theatrical about it. She was sharp, and she was his, and she had, over the past year, developed an attachment to Evelyn that she expressed in the Emma way, which was through sustained engagement and the quiet extension of trust, rather than anything demonstrative. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Emma picked up her toast. She chewed it. She looked out the window at the November morning, which was overcast and looked like it might rain later. Then she looked back at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I think it's a good idea," she said. "She's not that bad." He looked at his daughter. "You've been saying that for a year." "It's still true." She went back to her book. "Can I get new shoes this weekend? Mine are getting small." "We'll go Saturday," he said. She nodded, already reading again, and he sat across from her in the kitchen of the house that was theirs, and drank his coffee and felt the particular, improbable gratitude of a man who knows exactly how differently things could have gone. He called Evelyn at 7:30 when she was already in her car on the way to an 8 o'clock meeting. "The bridge," he said. "Tonight, 4:30. There was a pause on the line. He could hear her processing it, the date, the location, the significance of both. "Okay," she said. Her voice had gone quiet in the way it got when something landed. "I know you have things. Mason, I'll be there." 4:30. "I'll be there at 4:30, she said, and he could hear the almost smile in it. She knew him. She knew the thing about being on time. He hung up and drove to work. And the day was a day. Cold, physical, the specific satisfaction of construction work in the way it demands complete presence from your body and leaves your mind both occupied and strangely free. He worked the morning alongside Thule and a younger guy named Prescott, who asked too many questions but was learning fast. And at lunch he sat on a cooler and ate a sandwich and looked out at the gray water and thought about what he was going to say. He had never been good at speeches. He didn't think in the shape of speeches. What he thought in were situations, problems, the necessary next action. But there were things he needed to say today, and he wanted them to be true rather than polished, wanted her to hear what he actually meant rather than a managed version of it. So he sat on the cooler and thought it through the way he thought through anything that mattered, carefully and without rushing. By 2 o'clock he had it. Not words exactly. A direction. That was enough. The Mercer Street Bridge at 4:30 in November had the gray stripped quality of infrastructure in the off-season. The construction scaffolding from the repair work was gone now, the site long since completed and signed off. The bridge returned to its ordinary function of carrying cars over an ordinary street. There was nothing to mark what had happened here. No plaque, no memorial, no evidence that on a stormy Tuesday evening a year ago, a steel beam had fallen and a car had burned and a woman had been pulled out of it by a man who then walked away into the rain. The world had moved on from it, as the world does. Mason stood on the sidewalk below the bridge with Emma beside him, her yellow backpack over one shoulder, and looked at the ordinary pavement where the extraordinary thing had happened. He had not been back since that night. He hadn't avoided it deliberately. It was just that roots are roots, and he'd had no reason to come this way. It looked different in the daylight, without the rain and the fire and the crowd. Smaller than he remembered. The distances were shorter. He thought about that, how emergency compresses space, makes everything feel enormous and immediate, so that afterward, when you return to it in ordinary time, it seems diminished, like a room that was terrifying as a child and is just a room when you're grown. Here? Emma said. Right here, he said. The car was about there. He pointed. Beam came down from up there. Emma looked up at the bridge, then down at the street. She was doing what she always did, building the spatial model of it in her mind, placing the elements. It came from that high? Higher than it looks from down here. She was quiet, thinking. Then, were you scared? He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Not in the moment, after. In the truck, driving to get you, my hands were shaking. She looked at his hands. They're not shaking now. Different situation. She went back to looking at the street. What made you go in? Like, why you and not someone else? He had thought about this before. He had a real answer. Training, he said. I knew how to assess it fast. I knew there was a window before the fuel caught. Most people freeze not because they're cowards, but because they genuinely don't know what to do, and doing the wrong thing can make it worse. I knew what to do. He paused. That's the only reason. It wasn't brave. It was just applied knowledge at the right moment. Emma looked at him sideways. That sounds like something you'd say to avoid being called brave. He almost smiled. Maybe. Dad, she said, it was brave. You can just say it. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, standing on a sidewalk in November with her yellow backpack, telling him what he was allowed to say about himself. He thought about all the things she had asked him to be honest about over the years, and all the times he had chosen precision over simplicity, and how she had, consistently, called him on it. Yeah, he said, it was brave. She nodded. Okay. A car turned onto the street behind them. Emma turned to look, and he knew before he looked that it was the gray sedan Evelyn drove when she wasn't being driven. She'd bought it after the accident, unable to go back to the Mercedes, telling Mason only that she preferred something lower profile now, which he understood meant something else. Evelyn parked at the curb and got out. She was dressed for work still. She'd come straight from a board sign-off on the foundation's second-year budget. But she'd left the jacket in the car, and her hair was slightly less contained than it had been in the morning. She walked toward them, and something in her face when she saw the bridge was brief and then controlled, and then she was at the sidewalk beside them. She looked at the spot Mason had pointed to, just looked at it for a moment without saying anything. It's smaller than I remembered, she said. Yeah, he said. I was just thinking that. Emma said, Dad said the beam came from up there. Evelyn looked up. It did. She was quiet. I couldn't see it coming. I was on the phone. And then, it wasn't like the movies where everything slows down. It was just very fast, and then I was trapped. And then there was someone at the window. She looked at Mason when she said the last part. I remember thinking, she said, that your voice sounded like someone who had done this before. Not exactly this, he said. Something like this. He nodded. Emma was looking between them with the attention of someone who is watching a conversation that has a shape she can feel even if she doesn't entirely understand it. She had learned over the past year to give these moments room, to not fill them with 9-year-old noise, but to let them be what they were. Mason reached into his jacket pocket. He had thought about making this more complicated. He had thought about the right setting, the right moment, the right words arranged in the right order. He had thought about it, and then he had looked at who Evelyn was and who he was, and decided that what fit them was not ceremony but honesty, was not the right moment, but this moment, was not the arranged words but the true ones. He took out the ring. It was not complicated. A single stone, not large, set in white gold. He had chosen it the way he chose everything, by understanding what the thing was actually for, and finding the version that served that purpose cleanly. He had not taken Emma to help him choose it, because some things he needed to do alone, but he had told her it was happening, and she had said, without looking up from whatever she was reading at the time, "Don't get anything weird." He was fairly sure he hadn't. Evelyn looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Her expression was the one she had when something had arrived before she was technically prepared for it, which was not the same as being unprepared. She had known this was coming, known it in the way you know a season is turning before the temperature actually changes, but the actual arrival of it still did something to her face that she didn't manage. "Evelyn," he said. She was already looking at him. I'm not going to tell you what you are to me, he said, because you already know. You've been in the house, and at the table, and on the phone at 11 at night, and in the parking lot of a courthouse with terrible coffee. You know what this is. He paused. What I want to say is, I spent a long time being someone who carries things alone because I thought that was the only honest way to be strong. And I was wrong about that. I didn't know I was wrong until you showed me, not by telling me, but by just being someone who was worth letting in. He stopped. She was very still. Beside him, Emma had gone the particular quality of still that she reserved for things that were serious. I want to do this with you, he said. The whole thing. The dinner table and the bad days and Emma's homework and whatever comes next. I want you in it, officially. He held the ring between them. If you want that. Evelyn Hart, who had run a publicly traded company since she was 26, who had sat across from hostile boards and aggressive attorneys and investigative journalists without flinching, who had rebuilt herself from a burning car and a shattered arm, and a story that tried to diminish what it couldn't understand. Evelyn Hart looked at this man and his ring and his daughter and the ordinary November street where she had almost died a year ago, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too specific for the word happy, something that had the weight of everything she had wanted without knowing exactly what she was wanting. Yes, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. Obviously, yes. He put the ring on her finger. Emma, who had been holding herself very still, let out a breath that was almost a word, and then crossed the sidewalk and put her arms around both of them simultaneously, which required a certain amount of logistical improvisation given the height differentials. And they stood there on the Mercer Street sidewalk, the man, the woman, the child, in a cluster that was slightly awkward and completely real. After a moment, Emma pulled back and looked at the ring with the appraising eyes she brought to all things that required assessment. That's not weird, she said. Good job. High praise, Evelyn said. Her eyes were bright. I mean it, Emma said. I know, Evelyn said. That's why it counts. I see. They went to dinner at the Thai place on Stoneway because Emma chose it, and no one argued with Emma's choices in this category anymore. And they sat in the window booth, and Emma ordered for all three of them with the efficiency of someone who has studied the menu and has opinions, and they ate pad see ew and spring rolls and talked about nothing that would have seemed significant to anyone watching. School, work, a problem with one of the foundation's new vendor relationships, Emma's ongoing negotiation with her teacher about extra credit reading. It was the most ordinary dinner in the world, and every moment of it was exactly what Mason would have chosen. There is something that nobody tells you about surviving the hardest things. They tell you about the strength required, about the discipline, about the training and the instinct and the willpower. What they don't tell you is what comes after the surviving, the strange work of learning to live in the space the hardness has cleared out, learning to want things again, learning to sit in a Thai restaurant with people you love and not be listening for what's coming to take it. Mason had been learning that for a year, and he was not finished learning it. He suspected he would be learning it for a long time, possibly his whole life. Possibly that was the actual work. But he was further along than he had been. The 3 a.m. clarity of a bad dream came less often. When it came, he had learned to get up and make tea and sit in the kitchen until it passed. And sometimes Evelyn was there, having driven over for no specific reason she would fully articulate. And they would sit together in the kitchen at 3 a.m. with tea, and that was its own kind of answer. He looked across the booth at Emma, who was explaining to Evelyn the specific injustice of the grading rubric for a recent science assignment with the detailed passion of someone arguing a legal case, and he looked at Evelyn, who was listening with the completely genuine attention she brought to things Emma said, and he thought about the green jacket he'd left on a parking meter in the rain. He thought about the way he'd walked away that night without expecting anything from it. He had not gone into that car looking for a future. He had gone in because it was the right thing, and he knew how, and he wasn't going to stand on the sidewalk watching someone die when he could do something about it. That was what he had been then, a man doing the thing that needed doing and expecting nothing from it. What he hadn't counted on was the thing doing something back. The adoption proceedings took 6 months. Evelyn had raised it first, carefully, in the way she raised things she wasn't sure how he would receive, by not raising it directly, by asking a question that circled it, by giving him room to land on the answer himself rather than feeling pushed. She had asked once, in the winter, whether Emma had ever had the formal legal arrangement that would give her a second parent on paper. He had looked at her. She has me. I know, Evelyn said. I meant a second one. He had thought about it for a while after that. Not because he had reservations about the answer, but because he wanted to be sure he was thinking about it for the right reasons, in the honest way. Not just because it was what he wanted, but because it was what Emma needed. He asked Emma. He sat across from her at the kitchen table one Saturday morning with the directness he'd always brought to hard conversations with his daughter, and he explained what it would mean, legally and practically, and he asked her how she felt about it. Emma had been quiet for a long time, long enough that he let the silence be. Would she be my mom? Emma asked. Legally, he said. What she is to you day to day, that's up to you. That's already whatever it already is. Emma looked at her hands. I already kind of think of her like that, she said. I didn't want to say it because... She stopped. Because? Because I didn't want it to be a thing I said, and then it wasn't true. She looked up at him. Like with my actual mom. I thought she was coming back for a long time, and it would have been better to just know she wasn't. He felt the weight of that land. He sat with it. This is different, he said. I know, Emma said. Evelyn isn't going anywhere. No, he said. She isn't. Emma nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Yes, I want that. He told Evelyn that evening on the phone. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that he said her name. I'm here, she said. Her voice had the particular compression of someone who is managing something large. I needed a second. Take your time. I want to do it right, she said. The legal process, I want to do it correctly, for her. I know. She deserves it to be done correctly. Evelyn, he said, she already knows what you are to her. The paperwork is just so the world knows too. Another silence. Then, you have a way of making complicated things simple. You have a way of making simple things rigorous, he said. Between the two of us, we might get it right. She laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that wasn't for a room. The process was exactly as bureaucratic and slow and occasionally maddening as legal processes involving families tend to be. There were forms and hearings and a home study and a guardian ad litem who interviewed Emma separately and reported to the court that the child was exceptionally clear-eyed about her situation and her wishes, which the guardian ad litem said with the tone of someone who had interviewed many children and found clarity unusual. Judith handled the legal filings with the same crisp competence she'd brought to the custody defense. Evelyn's attorneys handled the coordination on her side. Emma, when asked by various official people how she felt about the proceedings, answered their questions with the direct economy of someone who has thought the thing through and has no patience for re-examining it. She felt fine about it. She wanted it to happen. She would like it to happen sooner rather than later because the forms were taking a very long time and she had better things to do. The judge who approved the final order said, in his brief remarks before signing, that in 20 years of family court work he found it notable when a child came before him. Not confused or frightened, but simply impatient to have the official record catch up to the reality she was already living. He said it was a good sign. He signed. Evelyn and Emma walked out of the courthouse. A different courthouse, a different November, 1 year further on. And Emma took Evelyn's hand on the steps without making anything of it, the way she did things that mattered, simply, without performance, as if it were already the most natural arrangement in the world, which it was. The baby arrived in the spring. They had known since January, and knowing had changed the texture of the months between knowing and arrival in the way that these things always do, making the ordinary days feel charged with a significance that is both wonderful and slightly exhausting. Mason had been present for Emma's early years only in part, had missed the first months of her life to a deployment he could not undo, and he carried that absence as one of the quiet weights of his life. This time he was there for all of it, every appointment and every conversation and every 3 a.m. moment when Evelyn couldn't sleep and he would lie awake beside her in the house they had moved into together the previous fall, a house with a yard and a room for Emma and a room for whoever was coming and a kitchen that was already lived in and imperfect and entirely theirs. The house was in the Wallingford neighborhood, 3 blocks from a park Emma had approved after a thorough inspection that included assessment of the soccer field, the path suitability for her ongoing outdoor experiments, and the general character of the surrounding blocks. She had given it a rating of 8 out of 10 and said the remaining 2 points could be earned over time. He had painted the room himself. Evelyn had chosen the color, a soft, warm yellow that she said was neither too loud nor too neutral, and Mason had applied it over a weekend with Emma, providing critical commentary from the doorway about his roller technique. He had told her she was welcome to pick up a roller herself, and she had considered this offer and declined. The birth was in the early morning of a Tuesday in April, which made it, Mason noted to himself with the private humor of someone who keeps track of such things, another Tuesday. He had come to associate Tuesdays with the arrival of things that changed everything, and this one was no different. Her name was Clara. She was 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and she had the red-faced, temporarily outraged expression of all newborns who have just been informed of the situation they've been born into. And she was the most exhausting and consuming thing Mason had encountered since the specific exhaustion and consumption of the SEAL program, and she was completely devastating in the way that only very small people can be devastating to very large ones. Emma met her in the hospital room at 9 in the morning, brought by Tully and his wife Maria, who had become over the past year the kind of family-adjacent presence that defies clean categorization but is indispensable. Emma stood at the edge of the hospital bed and looked at Clara with the focused attention she gave to significant things. "She's very small," Emma said. "You were this small," Mason said. "I don't remember it," Emma said, which was reasonable. "Do you want to hold her?" Evelyn asked. Emma looked at the baby. Then she very carefully sat in the chair beside the bed and held out her arms in the arrangement they'd shown her, and Evelyn placed Clara into them with the careful deliberateness of someone who has recently learned to do this and is still learning. Emma looked down at her sister. Clara, who had been briefly quiet, opened her eyes and appeared to look at Emma in the unfocused way of someone who cannot yet see properly but is nonetheless registering that something is there. "Hi," Emma said. Her voice was entirely different from her usual voice, softer, slower, the voice of someone speaking to something fragile and important. "I'm your sister. I'm 9. I'm going to teach you everything." Mason stood at the foot of the hospital bed and looked at his family. He had been in the room for the birth of exactly one of his children, and the experience had done what these experiences do, rearranged his sense of what was significant, recalibrated the scale of things, reminded him with biological bluntness that life is not theoretical, that it arrives with weight and volume and noise, that it requires your complete presence and gives back something that cannot be adequately quantified. He looked at Evelyn, who was watching Emma hold Clara with an expression he did not try to name because it was too layered for a single name. She was not a person who cried easily. He knew that, had seen her hold things together in moments that would have unmade other people, but her eyes were bright, and she did not try to manage it. She looked at him. He crossed to the head of the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she leaned into him, and across the room Emma was still talking to Clara in that soft, slow voice, introducing herself, introducing the family, explaining the world, and Clara was doing whatever newborns do in the first hours of their existence, which is not quite listening and not quite not listening, and seems somehow to involve all of their available capacity regardless. "Hey," Evelyn said quietly, so only he could hear. "Hey," he said. "We have a lot of kids." "2," he said. "We went from 0 to 2 very fast." "Emma was already 9, he said. "That's true." She looked at Emma and Clara across the room. "She's going to be an excellent older sister. She's going to be a terrifying older sister," he said. "There's a difference." Evelyn smiled. It was the real one. "They'll figure it out." "They will," he said. He thought about what it cost to get here. Not financially, that was a different kind of accounting, easier in some ways, harder in others. He meant the other cost, the one paid in years of carrying things alone, in 3 a.m. clarity, in the long work of learning to be a father when no one had shown him how, in the even longer work of learning to let someone see him accurately and not preemptively withdraw. That cost had been real, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He was not the kind of person who turned a hard history into a simple lesson, who wrapped up the genuine weight of things in a clean conclusion. But he was also not the kind of person who couldn't acknowledge what was true. What was true was this: he had walked into a burning car and walked out of it without expecting anything. And the universe, which is mostly indifferent and occasionally something else, had handed him back everything. There's a thing about strength that most people get wrong, he had been thinking for a while. They think it's the same as hardness, that to be strong is to be impenetrable, to not need anything, to carry the weight without showing the carrying. He had believed that for a long time. He had been very good at it, and it had cost him things he would never fully inventory, had made him, for years, a man who was excellent in emergencies and almost unreachable in ordinary time. What Emma had given him first, and Evelyn had given him more of, was the other understanding, that strength is not the absence of need. It is the willingness to name the need and meet it honestly. It is the willingness to stand beside someone and let them stand beside you without reading that as weakness. It is, in the end, more difficult than anything else. More difficult than a deployment, more difficult than a courtroom, more difficult than holding a 400-pound beam in the rain. The willingness to be known. That was the hard thing. That was the real mission. He had been running from it for a long time, for reasons that made sense at the time and less sense now, and somewhere in the year that began with a storm and a burning car on a Tuesday evening, he had stopped running. Not because he had resolved everything, he hadn't, he wouldn't, but because the alternative had finally cost more than the thing he was afraid of. He was 38 years old. He had an ex-military shoulder that ached in the cold. He had a 9-year-old daughter who was currently delivering an orientation lecture to a 7-pound infant with the seriousness of a department chair. He had a wife who had walked into a hearing room she was asked to stay out of and stood at the edge of it with bad coffee because that was the kind of person she was. He had a foundation that was doing actual work in the world, and a job that was physical and honest, and a house in Wallingford with a yard Emma had approved, and a kitchen that smelled like someone lived in it. He was not a story about a hero. He had never wanted to be that. He was a man who had made the choices that made him someone his children could actually have, as Evelyn had said on a phone call a year ago, and he had not fully understood what she meant until right now, in a hospital room in April, with the proof of it breathing in his daughter's careful arms. Outside, Seattle did its April things, the cherry trees in the park. 3 blocks from the Wallingford house were doing what they did every spring, brief, extravagant, entirely unconcerned with being practical about it. The foundation processed 17 emergency disbursements that week. Tully's wife Maria had brought food to the hospital waiting room because she believed that hospitals needed more food, and she was right. Judith Crane sent a brief email that said, "Congratulations," which from Judith was the equivalent of a speech. Frank DeLuca, the investigator who had found Mason with his empty notebook and his coffee smell, sent nothing, which was right for him. The world continued in its ordinary, extraordinary way. And in a hospital room in the morning, a family that had been built from a storm and a falling beam and a green canvas jacket and bad courthouse coffee and a crooked Christmas tree and years of hard daily work sat together and was itself, imperfect, specific, real, and sufficient, more than sufficient. Clara, who had no opinion yet on any of it, fell asleep in her sister's arms with the complete unconscious trust of someone who has decided, without evidence and without reason, that she is in exactly the right place. She was not wrong.